I was forthrightly evangelized into Unitarian Universalism. I was 38 years old, living in Maine, driving a snowplow for a living and feeling very sorry for myself, when a friend invited me to his church. He said it was different. I rudely refused. Truth be told, I cursed his church. All blanking churches are the same, I informed him. They say they're open, but they don't want queer folk. To heck with you and your church. But my friend persisted. He knew his church was different. He told me his church cared about people, embraced diverse families, worked to make a better world. He assured me I could come and not have to hide any element of who I was. So I went. Oh, Mama, I went all right. And I dressed so carefully for my first Sunday visit. I spiked my short hair straight up into the air. I dug out my heaviest, oldest work boots, the ones with the chainsaw cut in the toe that exposed the steel. I got out my torn blue jeans and my leather jacket with all the fringe. There would not be one shred of ambiguity this Sunday. Those people would embrace me in my full Amazon glory. Or they could fry ice. On my way in, I carefully arranged my outfit so that it would highlight the rock-hard chip I carried on my shoulder. And I bundled up every shred of pain and hurt and betrayal that I had harbored and nurtured and carried with me from every other religious experience in my life. And I lumbered into that tiny meeting house on the coast of Maine. Blue jeans and boots, leather jacket, spiked hair, and belligerent attitude. I accepted my friend's invitation. And I went to his church. Now, I expected the little gray-haired ladies in the foyer to step back in fear. That would, in fact, have been familiar at that point in my life. Instead, those ladies stepped forward as I entered. They offered me a bulletin and a newsletter, and they invited me to stay for coffee. It was so odd. They never even flinched. They called me dear. But they pronounced it dia. stay for coffee, Dia. I stayed for coffee. I stayed for Unitarian Universalism. Yeah. Over time, the good folks of that congregation loved up the scattered parts of me and guided me from shattered to whole, from outcast to beloved among many. And those folks listened to me. I and my life partner became their poster children for the brand new Welcoming Congregation program. But that's fair, because those folks went on to provide important local pastoral and legislative ministries to gay folks in Down East Maine. We walked together and we helped each other to grow. Please, do not think that the transition on either part was smooth or swift. These were not imaginary superheroes. These were human beings, and this was the mid-1980s. During the worship service on my second or third Sunday there, a woman stood during Joys and Concerns to announce that all homosexuals had AIDS, all homosexuals were deviants who could not be trusted with children, public health, or civil society. All homosexuals should be quarantined, packed off to work camps to provide useful labor for society and keep their filthy lifestyle and deadly diseases to themselves. As that member spoke, I slowly sat upright from my customary slouch. I tucked in my arms. I looked furtively around to see who might be glaring in my direction. And I tried to remember if I had parked my car facing in or facing out in the parking lot. It's true. In its journey of covenant, this congregation had just stumbled onto an important crossroad. But as Joys and Concerns unfolded, not one person made reference to the call to quarantine homosexuals. The pulpit that morning was ably filled by a student from the local seminary. At the end of the sharing, the seminarian made a brief comment to ensure thus that not all of these sentiments that we had heard this morning represented the whole congregation, and that was it. We were done. Now, I was at a crossroad. Surely I left that week immediately after the service. But what about next Sunday? Would I go back? Why on earth would I go back? Going back would be, well, you fill in the word. Going back would be dangerous, stupid, foolhardy, looking for trouble, probably hurtful. But I went back. I was in the throes of learning my first lessons of being in covenant with religious community. When we covenant to walk together through all that life brings, it means when things get ugly, we do not walk away. Mercy, how we yearn to walk away. That's okay. But our covenants call us to abide and to work things through together. The next week, the regular minister was back, the service began as usual, and I did tense up when it came time for joys and concerns. Someone announced something like a birthday I certainly don't remember, but I vividly remember, as one by one, folks in that congregation rose to speak, folks who never talk in front of more than 2 people, folks whose voices we had never heard, one by one, stood up and some awkwardly, some forthrightly announced that not everything we heard last week was either right or true or representative of who we were as a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Thank you. The crossroad had been engaged, not by the minister or the board or a formal presentation. The crossroad had been engaged by the folks. The direction the congregation would take was being chosen. This congregation would not be stuck in conflict, mired in name-calling, or diverted from its gentle, steady trek toward the beloved community. Our aspirations were unfolding, one voice at a time. That congregation had reached a crossroad where one among them had begun the use of language that would depersonalize or endanger others. She tried to create a class of less than human persons toward whom violence would be acceptable. The congregation gently refused to follow. And then something to me even more extraordinary and wonderful began to unfold. I frankly had never seen it anywhere before. That congregation refused to depersonalize, refused to dehumanize the original speaker. Yeah. They stayed in what Martin Buber calls the I-thou relationship. They did not start calling her names. That homophobe, that gay basher, none of that happened. While the speaker tried to turn homosexuals into objects to be manipulated, the congregation never referred to the speaker in a way that was less than embracing and respectful of her full humanity. Later, in that same church, I opened the hymnal to find the words attributed to the Buddha. Never does hatred cease by hating in return. The Buddha taught, let us overcome violence by gentleness. Only through love can hatred come to an end. Never does hatred cease by hating in return. My friend was right. His church was different. He did forget to tell us, however, that his church on some Sundays, I could be in for a wild, wild ride. But he was right. His church really cared about making things right for everybody. Now, over time, attending general assemblies and district meetings and working with various groups at the church, I began to experience that shift that Anne Lamott described from the Peace March. I had walked into that meeting house as a bruised and belligerent I. I was fighting alone, but in time, the I turned to we. Lamott wrote, "In the energy and the signs and faces of the crowd were an intoxicating balm, and by some marvelous yogic stretch, we all stopped trying to figure out whom and what we agreed with and who the bad elements were. You just had to go." Fascinatingly out of control, the sea of people like a great heartbroken circus. Wild, living art, the I turned into we, moving at the pace of the whole organization. Pace. Oh, my word. I was frantic with the folks in Maine. I would have welcomed a SWAT team. I wanted that woman bodily lifted from the pews right that moment. I wanted a detailed denunciation of her ideas and a formal apology to queer folk for the whole planet. But that's not how human change works. That's not the pace of human learning, nor is it the pace of effective, world-changing work for justice. You know, when I heard that diatribe, I was immediately slapped into a sharp, prickly, fully alert sensation of my differences. I was other. So was the speaker. We were what Martin Buber called I-it, and not I-thou. And at the time, what I remember most is the sensation of holding my breath as I hurried out during the postlude. I ducked my head. I avoided eye contact. I spoke to no one as though the shame were mine. There was a man in the foyer between me and the exit door. I quickly glanced up at his face, silently pleading for him to please let me pass without any more pain. He smiled. He held the big oak door open for me gently, and he softly said, as I began to pass, "See you next week." My head snapped up then. I muttered something like, "Excuse me." Surely I had not heard him correctly, and he looked right at me and said, "See you next week." Was he mad? Was he impaired? Had he not just heard what that woman said? See you next week? See you next week. It was at once a question and an invitation. Surely, I thought as I scrambled to leave the parking lot, surely it was an invitation to madness. But for one thing, the man's voice, his soft smile, his gentle tone, his direct eye contact. He wasn't looking at the fringe and the spikes. He was looking here. Ours was an I-thou encounter, the very thing I had been seeking.